In this lecture, we're looking at the Crusades, and we're carrying on from our last lecture, where we looked at the First Crusade, as well as the rise of how the Crusading Holy War movement even got started in the first place. And we can begin by picking up the point we made at the very end of our first lecture on the Crusades, which is that one of the great challenges, once you've conquered this land, is that you have to keep it. You have to maintain it. You can't simply walk away and appoint a vassal, and the structures of politics and life are very much different when you're an occupying force than they are back home in feudal Europe. Well, the crusading spirit continued for some time. Those going on crusade were increasingly convinced that what they were doing was God's work. Well, over time, the Crusader States, those regions that were portioned out to the various rulers, to the various kingdoms after the First Crusade, increasingly came under fire from the Turks. And it all came to a head in December of 1144, when the region of Edessa, which was a state right to the north, just as you travel north from Jerusalem, as you would sort of hang a left, heading west on the way to Constantinople, that northern region was Edessa, a very pivotal area in some respects, at least in terms of defense. If you control that area, then you control both the northern access point, blocking off people who would potentially be coming down to Jerusalem in some ways, at least by land. And you would have a funnel for all those who were coming from the east down into the regions attempting to conquer it. Well, on December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugenius III issued another bull calling, in particular on the French, to take up the charge and to head off the crusade. Now, by and large, the Second Crusade really didn't get off the ground very quickly. By and large, the papal bull was ignored. Just goes to show, just because the Pope tells you to do something in the Middle Ages doesn't mean that it always happens. Well, the man who takes up the mantle and really gets this thing going is Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard is a monk and a theologian and a really well-respected person within the hierarchy of the establishment of the church. And we'll actually have a lecture entirely on Bernard's theology a bit later in this course. Well, Bernard takes it up, he begins to preach in favor of it, he lobbies for the kings and the powers of Europe to go on crusade. And finally, in the end, they do. Now, the Second Crusade started off better than the First Crusade. You don't have peasants running off without weapons, ravaging the land and angering your allies before you even get there. Still, the other complexity of this, and we signaled this complexity in our last lecture, was that the Byzantine Empire had not asked for help and had not asked for the West to come to their territories. Now you have to get the sting of this. The Byzantine Empire still sees itself as the heir to Constantine, and therefore they see themselves, at least perhaps in terms of rank or at least in terms of honor, as being the true heirs of the Roman Empire. And so for these Westerners to come to their regions without being asked was a bit of an affront to the emperor. There were ongoing struggles as well, in particular at the church level, as the ravages of the schism between East and West continued on. Well, the Byzantine emperor not only was unwelcoming to them, but again, just like the previous emperor, he forced the Crusaders to swear an oath to him, and he also threatened to cut off food if they didn't listen. Well, on and on the Second Crusade went, marching really quite slowly, and it all culminated in a real sort of fabled failure in terms of the Crusade, which is the siege of Damascus. Because essentially what happens when the armies arrive and the rulers arrive is they really don't have much of anything to do. They still owned and controlled so much of the land that was already there, even if they weren't dominant as they once were, even if there were some shrinking allies. Generally speaking, at least the nobility were sort of on a vacation, sort of touring around the Holy Land, seeing what they can do and taking in all the sights. Well, it's about 6 months later that they finally come together and they decide that they're going to do something. Well, the decision was that they were going to attack and take the city of Damascus. And historians have always scratched their head about this. Damascus was not a strategic location, and actually Damascus had, at least historically, since the First Crusade, been an ally to the Crusaders. What's also laughable is they didn't actually count the cost of the siege. They arrived at the city of Damascus, and they didn't have enough troops to even surround it. And Damascus had plenty of resources and orchards and food. They just sort of looked over the walls at these crazy Westerners who were trying to besiege them with not a full show of strength. And so, in the end, the Second Crusade goes out with a whimper and not with a bang. The same, however, cannot be said for the Third Crusade. If there is any romanticism in the heritage or the lore of the Crusades, it's from the Third Crusade. And this is true on both sides. Because on both sides, you have two enigmatic leaders. Three, really, if you count Frederick of Barbarossa. But Frederick is second fiddle by far. Well, in the Third Crusade, you have squaring off two of the most legendary characters from the Middle Ages. In this corner, in the West, you have Richard the Lionheart. And Richard is King of England, and he is known as an incredible warrior and an incredible strategist. On the other side, in the other corner, you have Saladin. Now, Saladin is one of the more important figures in the Turkish, Arabic, Islamic heritage. He goes down in history as one of the first that even the Western chronicles speak positively of. He was known to be charitable and merciful, but he was also known to be a significantly important warrior and a significantly important general. Well, what happens is Saladin, at first sort of a right-hand man rising up the ranks within the armies, and eventually himself as vizier, and finally as the ruler himself, ends up down in Egypt, ruling there, which of course is just a short trip over to the area of Jerusalem. Well, in 1174, Saladin moves to take control of the Abbasid Caliphate. His predecessor had died, and he makes sure that he is the successor. Then, at some point, he decides that he is going to make his name famous, and he sets his sights on Jerusalem. And in 1187, he actually manages to capture it. He brings 30,000 soldiers along, and the area of Jerusalem wasn't just the city itself. It was the surrounding environs, all of the little sub-kingdoms, in a feudalistic sense, that surrounded it. Well, over the course of about 2 years, Saladin not only takes the city of Jerusalem itself, but he takes the majority of those surrounding areas known as the kingdoms of Jerusalem. So by 1187, the Crusader States, or the estates of Outremer as they're known, are really under fire. In fact, they're in jeopardy of falling to the Arabic armies entirely. And with the fall of Jerusalem, the Pope, Gregory VIII, issues another crusading bull calling on those in Europe to go back and recover the lost lands, and in particular, to recover Jerusalem. Well, the armies make their way over, led principally by Richard the Lionheart, as well as others. And this one, the Third Crusade, ends, you might say, roughly in a stalemate. Saladin and Richard battle themselves to basically a stalemate. Richard appears, at least according to the records, to be slowly gaining the upper hand, when suddenly intrigue and problems back at home, namely the loss of power or the usurpation by some of his underlings in the estates that he's somewhat abandoned, force Richard to flee and head back to Europe. Well, Saladin and Richard actually form a truce. Saladin agrees that while he will hold all of these regions for himself, that he will not stop the pilgrims, the Christian pilgrims, from coming, and they will come with his protection. Now, as soon as Saladin dies, a number of those regulations go out the window. But the Third Crusade was really the source of so much of this rather mysterious, ethereal idea of brave men fighting their way through the Crusades. As we've seen, a lot of the Crusades are jumbled messes, but it's the Third Crusade that has good leadership, strong leadership, and it has these literary stories somewhat woven into the fabric of the Crusade itself. The Fourth Crusade, the one after it, not long after it, is not as romantic or as successful. In 1198, Innocent III is elected, and he immediately issues a crusading bull. Now notice how much faster the Crusades are getting. It seems that every pope wants to call a crusade whenever possible. Well, the Fourth Crusade ostensibly left to take Jerusalem back. The problem, though, is that on the way, the crusade was fraught with problems. They arrive in Venice in the early 1200s, and Venice agrees to build ships to take them over to the Holy Land, and then they don't have enough money to pay them. And then, along the way, as they go, they suddenly divert themselves through the ongoing struggle with the Byzantine Empire. There were a number of problems, lack of support, and other kinds of things that eventually diverted the crusade away from Jerusalem and towards Constantinople. And in June of 1203, the Fourth Crusade actually arrives in Constantinople, and it seeks to intervene in one of the intrigues of Byzantine politics. Namely, they didn't like the guy on the throne, and they sought to put their own man on the throne, who was the biological successor to one of the previous emperors. And it was a bit of a tense standoff for a while. That is, of course, until April of the following year, when suddenly the Crusaders attacked and assaulted Constantinople. For several days, they sacked it, they rioted all throughout the streets, and they suddenly put a Western emperor, or a man who had Western allegiances, on the Byzantine throne. So here you have a crusade, ostensibly launched to go and retrieve Jerusalem after its loss to Saladin, now churning to attack the Byzantine emperor and the empire itself, and taking down the city of Constantinople. Now that's very important because Constantinople had never fallen in all of its history, all the way back to the 4th century. And it was a serious sting for centuries, as long as Constantinople was in Christian hands, that its first failure, its first defeat, came at the hands of their Christian brethren from the West. And the West essentially holds power over the Byzantine Empire, at least by name, for some time. It's over 100 years. Now, here's a myth. This is not the reestablishment of Eastern and Western churches. It's complicated, but just because you've taken the empire doesn't mean that you have somehow taken over the church itself. And besides, the empire itself broke off and began to travel to other parts of the Byzantine world and set up counter states to the puppet king that they saw in the city of Constantinople. Well, the years wear on. The crusading spirit doesn't die. Rather, the crusading spirit, as historians call it, had now sunk into the medieval bloodstream. As the centuries wear on, the Pope becomes quite keen to call quote-unquote crusades against just about anything that is an assault or an affront to the Catholic Church. So there is, for a period of time, a crusade called for Spain, for the long 100 years conquest and the reestablishment of Christians within the Spanish regions. There's also something called the Albigensian Crusade, which is a group of heretics that are located in the southern Swiss regions, sort of right there on the border near Switzerland. And the Albigensians were somewhat like Marcionites. They actually believed that God and Satan were somewhat equal deities, and that there was this sort of yin-yang, opposite forces of good and evil. It just goes to show heresies really never die. Well, the Pope condemned the Albigensians, but he also called a crusade against them. And a number of armies went to war on this, actually went after the Albigensians. So as you can see, there really is an evolution and something in the bloodstream now within the Catholic Church about this idea of going on a crusade. It never ceases to die. It stays around for hundreds of years. In fact, one of the last times that a crusade was nearly called was actually in the early 1500s. Because just on the eve of the Reformation, in fact, well into the Reformation, there was a Muslim army, an Ottoman army, crashing up the area of what we call the former Soviet bloc of Europe, Eastern Europe. And they traveled up into Poland, and at one point they were besieging Vienna. It really is almost like the conquest of Al-Andalus, only this time they're coming from the eastern flank, not the western flank. And in the early 1500s, there was a council called that attempted, and very nearly did, call another crusade. And we'll never know because it's just conjecture. But if Luther had not come on the scene and begun the Reformation, there is at least some evidence that another crusade would have marched off. At least marched far enough to meet the Ottoman Empire there in the eastern part and down in the Balkans. And the last story I want to tell is of one of the more poignant moments when the crusading spirit really goes awry. And that is the Children's Crusade, as it's called, in the year 1212. We're not quite sure what triggered it, what caused it. The consensus generally with scholars is that the children began marching in protest at the loss of Jerusalem and what they believed was a lack of attention to the need to go on crusade. to reconquer Jerusalem. So they're, in a manner of speaking, on protest. Well, the kings of Europe tell them to scatter, tell them to kiss off. At which point, the children seem to go on a march on their own. They're not willing to take no for an answer. And again, there's something going on here that's hard to understand. The children in this crusade range from the age of 6 to 14. And on they marched down, down, down until they reached the areas of Italy. Now, again, they had no weapons. These were children. There is something of the sort of Gideon spirit that they believe that their cause is just, that God is on their side, and that if no one else will do it, well, then they will go. And they simply disappear. Most scholars believe that as they arrive in the area of Italy, they request that some merchants put them on their ships and take them to Jerusalem or somewhere in that region so that they may go on crusade. And at least a number of these youths were taken off and sold into slavery. Estimates are hard to gauge here. They range from as high as 30,000 children lost to probably too conservative a number of around 7 to 10,000. Tens of thousands at the high end, but at least thousands, closer to 10 to 15 at the minimum, I think, of children were lost. The crusading spirit had so infected the perspective and the outlook. This belief that God always blesses pilgrims, and if the war is just and you're a holy pilgrim, it doesn't matter if you're a 6-year-old boy or a 14-year-old boy, whatever it might be, you may march off to crusade. And should you die, that's fine. You will receive a plenary indulgence. You will bypass purgatory, and you will enter directly into heaven. Well, the Crusades go on. There are others. We're not going to go into all the details. The first 4 in the Children's Crusade are the ones that are best known. The Albigensian Crusade is another one. Well, what are we to make of all this? Well, a couple things outright. The desire to go on crusade, in none of the evidence that's out there, and none of the arguments for crusade, was frankly drawn from the Bible. This is a really important fact to get. You really have to read into either the book of Revelation or some other texts to get some sense that you need to get on a horse and drive to the desert in order to kill some Islamic people or some people from that region. When Pope Urban called for the crusade in his first iteration, he was calling on the political orders to go and rescue brothers in peril out in the east. As such, it really was not supposed to be much of anything at all. He was not calling for some sort of religious fervor, some sort of religious extremism to go off and slay the infidel. Now, he spoke incredibly harshly about them, and he painted quite a vivid picture of how the Islamic armies treated the citizens and Christians in the regions. But that's to be expected in this day and age. But what he was not calling for is for all the numbers of thousands of people to go off to crusade. Even the sermon itself by Urban, the one that called for the crusade, was a simple call for a relieving army to go and save their Byzantine brothers. However, once on crusade, the fog of war set in. I always tell my students, why do people in the military train so hard? Why is it that when they get off the bus at boot camp, that there's always someone yelling in their face to say, "Sir, yes, sir," and do whatever they are told? And even those who haven't served in the military know the principal focus of so much of the drills and of the structure of military forces, not just in North America, but anywhere in the modern world, is for discipline. Well, why do they need discipline? Frankly, because in the midst of war and in the hot moment where you're ready to kill because you are tired, hungry, bitter, and angry, it needs to be ingrained almost into your cellular DNA level that you're going to obey your superior officer. Well, when the First Crusade marched off, they had no such structure. In fact, in a manner of speaking, they had less structure than even most armies by the standards of their own day. And it is simply the fact that there was a bloodlust that was captured, some sort of spirit of crusading that began to affect the Western Church for some time. Now, what's usually lost in all this is usually there's a utopian idea that out in the East, it was relatively calm, and the West got hacked off and they went over there and made everyone upset. Well, that just shows the Western bias of all these people talking about history. Because, see, if our heritage came from the Byzantine world, we would know that those who lived close to either the Turkish armies and over the centuries they were replaced by the Ottomans, that there were wars and skirmishes and fights for centuries, all the way back to the beginning of the Arab expansion. In fact, assigning blame, who drew first blood, is nearly impossible. Because just as we can trot out all kinds of evidence of times when Muslim armies committed atrocities and were rapacious overlords, and we can talk about all the times when Christians did the same thing. The mudslinging of which one is superior and which one is inferior is simply ahistorical, and frankly, it probably comes from a position of wanting to blame religion itself for war or these kinds of violent moments. Because we've all seen how in the 20th century, political nations that are anti-religious are peaceful, calm, rational, and cerebral, and never commit atrocities on their people. But if Westerners lived in these Byzantine worlds, the ongoing reality of fights and problems, at least at the political level, would have been nonstop. It would have been constant. Rather, what happens is the West, relatively secure in and of itself, having conquered the majority of Europe and imposed a political order on top of it, marches off to the Middle East and takes into themselves this rather fervent desire to control land that they had never controlled before. And this is all wrapped up in apocalypticism, at least at the lay level, with some kind of focus on the moral sanctity of this level of violence going off to holy war. So rather, Christians ought not to either hide from this, nor simply take it as face value whenever someone slanders and says that Christians committed innumerable atrocities in the Middle Ages, and that we were just slaying men, women, and children left and right. That simply is tunnel vision of this period of time. I do often get the question, what's my view of the Crusades? Don't I feel bad about some of the atrocities that happened? My response, usually tongue-in-cheek, is that they don't know the half of the atrocities that I feel chagrin for, that I feel repentance and remorse for. I think rather the Christian response is to say that the biblical motif is to repent even for the sins of your fathers and your fathers' fathers. I think we can own this. We can say this is not something that should have been incorporated into the identity of the Christian church, no matter how temporary it might have been. Because frankly, in the grand scheme of the 2,000-year history of the church, this is rather small in comparison, even if you consider that the crusading spirit is there for a total of 400 years. That's a bit generous. It ebbs and flows. That's 400 years out of 2,000. That's certainly not the majority of the Christian church. So I'm not willing to push it off the table and say, well, that was the medieval times, that was the Catholic Church, this kind of a thing. Even as a Protestant, I say this is our heritage as well. That being said, this day and age was filled with bloody wars and violence. And not just between Islamic armies and Christian armies. Dig down one layer deep beneath the popular understanding of the sweep of history, and you'll find all kinds of wars and fights and skirmishes going on here. Not just two armies that have different religions, and they're both fighting for the sake of holy war, but rather, it is a time of enormous violence. They don't call it the Middle Ages for nothing. Still, war, violence, and bloodshed and atrocities are not the norm for any century or any year of the church. Saying that because there were these crusades that committed atrocities, that therefore the entire Middle Ages itself is somehow suspect, is simply making the tail wag the dog. So, to summarize, we own it. We say that should not have happened. That is our heritage, and we can repent in a manner of speaking. We can express remorse for these things. There's no defensiveness here. But on the other hand, we need some context. We need to understand the Crusades. There was as much Christian-on-Christian harm during these Crusades, at least at certain moments, as there was Christian-on-Muslim harm, or vice versa. So the Crusades are a tragic moment, a violent moment in the church's history. It should not have happened. There is no biblical justification for this. And yet, in a bloody age where there are lots of dogfights, it's hard to say that one side is on the side of the devils and one side on the angels. Rather, both sides, frankly, have a lot of repenting to do.